good morning or good afternoon. Actually, my name is Patrick Haley. I work at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. I'm the Air Cargo Facilities Manager. And basically that role encompasses about 130 acres of infrastructure and responsibility on the north side of the airfield. And a lot of folks have a tendency to say, well, why do we have cargo at Seattle? What is there a need for cargo? And if you look at it at the infrastructure of aviation as a whole, it's basically a tube. If you look at a circle of an airplane, yes, you have the passengers on board, but every opportunity that you're flying, take a look under and outside that window, you're going to see the infrastructure and the supply chain that is continuously moving here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what is air cargo. It's not just FedEx, not just DHL, not UPS, not discounting the integrators and what they're called, but every carrier has a cargo infrastructure that establishes the yield of the airplane and actually increases the yield of the airplane. So there's, mind you, you have the baggage that's down below, but there's also there's a huge space factor that can be filled up with cargo or supply chain parts or just-in-time transportation requirements. And so basically, we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about what is air cargo. So here's another great understanding, just as a quickie, is that especially as we're moving towards the Christmas season and the holiday season here, is how do things move? And if you're having a widget and where you want to move that widget anywhere around the United States or anywhere around the world, especially here in the Pacific Northwest with the #1 exporter in the United States, we are the #1 exporter by value, how those products are actually moved. So it's not just the opening of the individual package, it's the supply chain as it was spoken about in a couple of the other videos, and it's very specific here in the total value of air freight that's moved through Seattle. 24.5 billion, and that was just in 2022. We have to update statistics, but this was 2022, and if everyone, that was still in the thralls of the pandemic at the time. You could look at all the different types of products that are both imported and exported out of Seattle, but you'll notice one big swath over there, and that's your domestic air freight, your express, and e-commerce. So where does that bring us? You know, from the drive that we had in 2022, 21, 20, and 19, you can see the percentage of air cargo that's increasing exponentially. However, during those pandemic years, we also had a decrease in domestic movement, but an increase in international movement. Or I'm sorry, the opposite. The international movement actually dropped down. And what was the reasoning for that? Well, the #1 reason was the international traffic basically stopped. So if it decreased by 29%, how did that increase in domestic airflow move? Well, basically, the passenger airplanes all parked, except for 5, 6 different carriers that actually took the opportunity, and infrastructure-wise, and said, I don't want to pay for those airplanes to be sitting on the ground. I'm going to take the seats out of them. And I'm actually going to put the freight on the airplane while there's no seats. I'm going to put it up in the overhead bins and increase the cargo flights by 125%. These were done by multiple different carriers and just a few. Of course, we all know about FedEx and DHL. But Cargolux, based out of Luxembourg. You have EVA Air, a Taiwanese carrier, Korean Air out of Incheon, and Lufthansa out of Frankfurt, were specific carriers that took their passenger operations and then supplemented their actual cargo operations. But how did they all do this? Well, it took some infrastructure design because if you're utilizing a ULD or a unit load device, you can't normally put that onto an airplane that has passenger seats. So there was an infrastructure change of how do we get these packages on board through the buildings as well as onto the ramp. One particular company figured this out pretty well. However, they have a tendency to state that they're an airline. They've chosen not to be an airline. They've chosen to actually contract out other carriers to do the work for them. So if you see the prime colors on an airplane, it's not just that airplane. It's the 120 that they have out in the fleet, and they're letting other carriers manage it. So you've got airlines called Air Transport International or ATSG or Sun Country, and actually Hawaiian Airlines has jumped into the fray. So they're going to be operating A330s on behalf of these guys. So the economic impact for air cargo is huge here in the Pacific Northwest. And the primary reason is we are a major manufacturing hub, as well as a software development. The total value is $24.5 billion, but there's a couple of different conversations in the previous panel that really bring to mind. It's jobs. Supply chain drives infrastructure, it drives transportation, it's jobs. We figure about 120,000 jobs specifically. The Pacific Northwest, ironically, this map is missing one new placement. I don't have a laser on here, I don't think, but we just added traffic to Manila 3 times a week. So there's more opportunities for freight movement directly between the Seattle market and the Philippines. But the economic impact is the extreme interest. Only 1% of the value of all the movement of the product all over the world is done by air freight, because the majority is done by sea. However, it's 35% of the overall value, and that's primarily because of your electronics, your just-in-time transportation, your artwork, animals if needed, and so it gets to be that high-value function. And this is a great example of what it took during the pandemic to actually put freight on top of airplanes. This was an airplane that was all seated, but we had to figure out a way to get it through the passenger doors. And the first airplane that came into Seattle with PPE, which was the biggest item that we had back in those time frames, was an EVAN aircraft flying in from Taipei. That Taipei aircraft had everything loaded into the gills, including the lavatories. There wasn't a flight attendant on board because it didn't need it. It was all freight. And so we literally loaded the boxes inside the airplane. So here at Seattle, we have 17 facilities, 130 acres in the commercial area. We call the commercial area everything north of 170th. So when you're driving down the North Expressway, if you're not from the Pacific Northwest, and you actually see all these, look to the right of the air traffic control tower. You're going to start seeing a conglomeration of different types of buildings. Of course, these buildings were built from 1968 to the earliest one in 2001. So this is where the infrastructure piece comes into play. We have anything from a facility that is relatively brand new in 2001, an old Northwest Airlines built facility, to a 1968 building that I'm actually heating with 30-ton rental units on the outside, because the infrastructure of the heat exchangers are so large I have to tear walls out from 1968. The majority of these buildings were all built under what we call ground leases. The Port of Seattle, as a landowner, literally leases the ground to these individuals, and then over a period of time, those ground leases terminate, and at the end of the termination, the leases state, you return it back to the green space, or we give you back the improvement. Well, if I have a 35-year-old building, it's no longer an improvement. I have sustainability issues, I have heating issues, I have electrical issues, and the tenants will have a historical point. In this particular building, it's the worst one on site, built in 1969. I have a temporary HVAC units that are actually plumbed into the plenums to heat the buildings. And this is where we wanted to bring this conversation specifically for this group, is that it's all wonderful and beautiful at the terminal. It's pretty. It looks nice. This is the infrastructure after the fact that the carriers want. It's amazing for the passengers, and we respect that, because the passengers bring in the freight operation. Every time a carrier comes into Seattle, then the conversation is, how do we move the passengers on board? And then there's a subset of that carrier, whether it's Philippines or Qantas is a carrier we'd all love to have here, or Qatar Air or Emirates. They'll come to the cargo team and go, okay, how do we fill the bottom of this to make this airplane profitable, coming all the way here to Seattle? I've got leaking roofs, 5 different tenants, 2 airlines. And if I have to change this building or build out this building, where am I going to put those 5 tenants? And that becomes a larger picture of the encompassment of our problems here at SeaTac. We only have 2,500 acres. Well, I mistake that. 2,501 acre. That's all we have. There's no other space to grow. There's no other place to put it. And anyone living here in the Pacific Northwest knows that 2 years ago there was a big concern about building another airport. Of course, no one wants it in their backyard. So where do we put it? Conversations are, well, let's put it over Moses Lake. That'll be great. Anyone who lives here, tries to drive over the Snoqualmie Pass here in about a month, knows that you're not going to travel on a regular basis. So how do you move supply chain from the Kent Valley, where it's all at, to Moses Lake, to then fly back over SeaTac? Next building we have is 161F. We've done a whole naming convention on the individual facilities. This building was turned over to us with structural pure damage from the individual tenant, because it's stated in the lease, I give it back to you as it is, or I turn it over to green space. The structural beam that I'm speaking of was hit by a forklift, which then shifted it off its pilings by 8 inches. And because it was no longer tied to the concrete floor, it started twisting under the force, both by the roof and the floor. The issue then came to play is, okay, I'll shut the building down. There's 7 airlines that are operating out of here. 7 airlines, British Airlines, Cargolux at the time, Emirates, JetBlue, you name it. So where do I tell those 7 carriers to go? Building 161D, as you can see, is a kind of what we call a Franken building. It was built one half in 1974, the other half in 1991. The 1974 side of the building actually has leaking and leaching heavy metals in the roof. There are different codes, different fire codes, and most of my HVAC is all running to failure. 161E is one of our first buildings that we're doing a complete retrofit of, and the slide isn't showing very well, but there's seven different carriers in here, including Southwest Airlines, another small airline called Atlas Air that's based in here, Empire Air is based in here, and these are carriers that are moving freight on behalf of FedEx and other airlines. We're at the 90% design, and this is our hardest building. We've chosen this as the hardest building. It was built in 1982 as a cross-dock operation. It was not built as a freight building. It still has a sauna in it. Why do you have a sauna in a freight building? Not sure. Multiple tenants, different classifications. Building. It's got B1 and S1 classifications for the building. So it encompasses an office operation as well as a warehouse and 2 auto shops, because all the equipment on an airport is still required to be worked on in some form or fashion, whether it's a tug or a loader or a bus. Our next building up is 160A. As you can see, this is another Franken building. This is the FedEx, primary FedEx facility that does have a loading, it does have a sort system very similar to what you saw in the video. That building was built in different times. First one was built by Flying Tigers. Anybody remember Flying Tigers? Bought by FedEx in 1986. Different codes, leaching heavy metals, no fall protection under the requirements. And the current lease terminates in 2028. I actually spoke with a tenant yesterday, and they were like, yes, you're taking the building over soon, aren't you? I don't have to pay for it. The next building, actually, I get back in 5 weeks, and this has been what we have learned for a lessons learned perspective is all of the things that we've done in the last 6 years, this role within the port. This building actually reverts back to us on December 1. The previous tenant was given a building condition assessment and provided the requirements to upgrade some items on the first year of that building condition assessment 2 years ago, and they said, no, we're not going to do it. We don't have to. The lease says I give it back to you in green space, or I give it back to you the improvements. So we have a huge amount of ACM challenges, regulated materials, so asbestos all over the flooring issues. Once the lease runs out, I've picked 150 days into the sky to say I'm going to take care of one half of the building in that 150 days and abate all the ACM, putting new floorings, new windows, new doors, increase the efficiency with LEDs, and hopefully we'll be ready to go with the northern portion of the building, and then I can swap it out in the back. All this is done while we're still moving freight. So if you look at SeaTac Airport, people will tell you is that, well, wait a minute, why is this all this construction? Why can't we just stop this construction? It just takes too much time. Well, basically, the carriers are keeping coming. They're not going to stop. And whether it's Alaska, Delta, any United, American, any of the major carriers or the international carriers, they're still coming because we want them to come. We want to go see Mickey. We want to see Grandma. And we aren't going to stop wanting to see Mickey and Grandma, and anyone telling the airport that it needs to stop expanding isn't understanding that it's the passengers that are driving that match. And so the risk challenges that come into play if we stop building or if we stop increasing our infrastructure is a perception. The passenger enplanement is allocated to the general fund. There's a passenger enplanement fee that basically pays for airports. Airports are not paid for by tax dollars. It's all through passenger enplanement costs or leases or other opportunities within concessions. What happens if we have a cyber attack? Which we did, August 24th. Anyone that tried to go through boarding passes saw a bunch of folks and some amazing folks in green vests all standing saying, here's the bathroom, here's checkpoint 2, here's the bathroom. Where does technology come into play? Luckily enough, cargo wasn't affected. We were actually able to move forward with a lot of the product line and continue the just-in-time transportation with that. This is where we come in, and I've got 31 seconds to talk about the Sustainable Airport Master Plan. This is where we have actually published this. The NEPA was published just this last week, and meetings are happening, as Bukta spoke about it earlier, in coordination with the 5 communities around the airfield to be able to say, this is what's going on. We're not expanding. We have nowhere to expand, but we have to build and do this in an equitable manner. In our commercial area, that includes increasing the terminal space off to the north and taking some of those old buildings out and turning them around and building them up. And that's where it comes into the play of, is it worthwhile to tear a building down, or is it worthwhile to retrofit a building? The Sustainable Airport Master Plan, cargo near-term projects. I know that I'm supposed to answer questions in the back, and that brings me down to 0 minutes. So thank you very much, Ken and Infraday. I really appreciate it for inviting the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Thank you.